Hey everybody, and welcome back to the IzzyVerse. Today we're going to have a great show. I have a fantastic guest with me that we'll invite into the show in a minute. But before we do that, as you already know, there are a few things I want to go over with you guys, starting with a lot of things are happening last weekend, and I'm going to be discussing about it this weekend. So the first thing is Mocha Fest already happened. I hope if you had a chance to go, that was great. That's fantastic. I did interview a lot of people, and I'm going to periodically be sending out videos throughout the week of interviews I've done during the Mocha show. It was a fun show. I got to talk to a lot of great people from different walks of life and everything. So be on the lookout for those videos. They're going to be streaming on Instagram, and then I'm going to put a big collection all together on YouTube. Also, this Wednesday, I'm going to be talking to folks from Cap Wrestling Academy. So they're a wrestling academy founded in Long Island, and I went to one of their events. I'm going to go to another one of their events pretty soon. It's a great indie place, and this is a place where people get started. This is where MJF's got started. Matt Caster, Matt Cardona was there as well one time. So really good stuff, and I'm going to have a great time. And we're going to continue this week with our Inkers. Today I'll be talking to Scott Hanna, and on Thursday I'll be talking to Keith Williams. We're going to talk a little bit about his work as well, and we'll talk some more about other things that are happening, like Free Comic Book Day. In fact, my guest for today is going to have a book that's going to be showcased on Free Comic Book Day for Marvel, and we'll talk about that later. And of course, I have to mention Squiggy's Dugout. That's where I get my comic books from. And it's in New Rochelle, and you need to get any books, and you need a shop to go to in New Rochelle, and you're in the New Rochelle area, go check out Squiggy's Dugout. It is a fun place for comic books. All right, with that being said, I'm going to introduce to you guys a fantastic inker. All right, someone who has been in the industry for 35 plus years, from my understanding. He's worked on Batman, he's worked on Superman, he's worked on Spider-Man, Punisher, you named it. He's worked on it. So let me introduce to you all, without further ado, Scott Hanna.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Scott, how is everything?
Very good. Actually, right now on my table, I actually have Batman Urban Legends story I'm working on, and I've got Amazing Spider-Man I'm working on. So I'm working on my two favorite characters right now.
Which you have worked in the past together.
Yes.
I was going to talk a little bit about that too. First of all, what a career you've had. 35 plus years, am I right?
Well, yes, supposedly it's very hard to keep accurate count of all this stuff, but supposedly I've drawn more pages of comic books than anybody else alive.
Really?
Or actually, not more than anybody else in the history of American comics. Let's put it that way.
Oh, you got to call the Guinness Book of World Records for that.
Yeah, I think my rough estimate is I'm at about 23,000 pages so far, and as far as I'm aware, something like only 2 other artists have ever made over 20,000 pages.
Wow, that is impressive, and congratulations. Yeah. And I'm sorry for your hand, but
hey, I still love it. I'm still drawing on a daily basis.
Yeah, so I'm sure you have a lot of years to go as well, right?
Hopefully, yes.
Yes. So let's start with the beginning, right? I want to talk a little bit about your love for comics, where it came from, how it started. So can you share with us, with the audience, a little bit about that?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, my mother is actually a fine artist. So she's a portrait painter and landscape artist. So I was kind of surrounded by art as I was growing up as a kid. But around 10 years old, I discovered superheroes. I think the very first comic book I remember getting, a superhero comic book, was Justice League of America, because I wanted to get the whole team with a lot of different characters in it. And I literally fell in love with superheroes almost immediately. And from that point on, I decided I actually wanted to be an artist, but I didn't necessarily say I wanted to be a comic book artist. But I definitely didn't want to do that fine art thing that my mom did. I was like, okay, this is a lot more fun drawing superheroes and action and drama. And growing up, my two favorite characters were Spider-Man and Batman, because they also both had the best bad guys. So that was how I grew up. I was always drawing and doodling and sketching, and I really knew I wanted to be an artist, but I still didn't think of comics as a real job. Now, I grew up in New Jersey, and not too far away from the Joe Kubert School. And I actually went for a short time to some of the Saturday morning sketch classes they had. And I happened to go to a Votech school that Andy Kubert was going in the afternoon class. I was going in the morning class. Adam Kubert had also gone to this class. A whole bunch of comic book artists went through this school. And Joe Kubert, because he saw my work at the end of the year, because Andy was in the afternoon class, and he was like, "Wow, this stuff is really good. I want to recruit you for my school." And at that time, I still didn't think of comics as a real job. So I'm like, no, I don't want to go to a comic book specialty school. I want to go to the big city, New York City, and go to a real art school, right? So that was now. Literally, if I had gone to the Kubert School, I probably would have been working in comics like 5 or 10 years before I did, because I did a kind of roundabout way. But anyway, I majored in illustration. It just so happened that all of my best friends and most of the best artists of the school I went to were all into comic books. So I went to school with people like Mark Chiarello, George Pratt, Kent Williams, John Van Fleet. All of us had, good chunks of time working in comics. So they kind of maintained the love of comics, and the school actually hated comics. Like, nobody at the school appreciated comics in any way, but it turned out that all of the best artists in my year were all into comics, and they're like, what's going on here that every one of the top artists in the school is into the same stuff? So by the time I got out of school, we had totally transformed the whole school. They had a comic book club. All the teachers were really getting really into comics, but they didn't teach us about comics. We taught them about comics, which is a hard way to go about it. But even so then I got out of school. I actually thought I wanted to do book cover painting and album covers, which I did some of, but it really wasn't fun. It was kind of like a job. It was work. And it turned out that my buddies who I'd gone to school with, who were doing some comic stuff, said, "Scott, you got to try this out." So I started doing comic books again, found out I really enjoyed it. It fit my skill set. So like all my knowledge of anatomy, my knowledge of even color, and some of my inking skills all really fit comic books. And I found out, I was like, wow, they actually pay me to draw superheroes. This is cool. So once I got into comics, I was like, wow, I got this scam going. They're actually paying me to do this stuff. I'm going to keep doing this as long as they're willing to pay me. As long as they're foolish enough to pay me money to do this for a job, I'm going to be happy doing this job. And 35 years later, I'm still doing the job because I still love it.
You're still working the scam, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I got him totally fooled. It's great.
I have no idea.
Right.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I remember growing up. I think when I was growing up, it was a bit of a transitional because again, I grew up in the Bronx, and in the Bronx, I went to the local community school, and of course, they didn't have a comic book curriculum or anything like that. So you had to go with the next best thing, which in my case was graphic design, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
they got graphic design, and in reality, it has nothing to do with comic books in that way.
Right.
But what I ended up learning, that's how I learned Photoshop, and then eventually all the other stuff that came along with that. Um, and I remember ever since like really middle school for me, it was all about drawing comics, and I drew characters all the time. I made my own characters. I copied other people's work. I must have copied some of the work that you did as well, I'm sure. Um, and I'm actually older than I seem, but it just felt that way at that time. It was right. This is what I like to do, and I'm going to keep on doing it. And I eventually, in the mid 2000s, that's when I finally decided to do some art and do it, in some level, not to a major professional level, but again, when you get, I think, like myself, when you get to a certain age, the dream has always been Marvel, DC, right? That's always the
Right.
dream,
Yeah.
right? But when you
Well,
get to a
that
certain
used
age,
to be the dream. Now
yeah,
there's so much other cool stuff out there. Yeah.
exactly. But I think for a lot of people, that's a lot of it's still there because it's like Spider-Man, Batman, Superman.
Yeah.
You know, nothing against anyone in particular, nothing against any particular characters, but you don't hear people say, "I can't wait to learn how to draw Invincible," even though it's a great character. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but it's a cool character. Just the idea behind a character like that. So the dream was always that, but then when I finally got into doing it and started doing sequential work, there was a love about just storytelling by itself, and
Right. Yeah.
then that became a thing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be superhero based; it could
Oh,
be
absolutely. Yeah.
anything, pretty much anything you want,
Yeah.
and things like that. And I think that's where the love became even bigger, and that's when, like I was telling you before we were talking about. Um, the love of guys like John Romita Jr.'s artwork came into play because now I learned what storytelling really means. Um,
Exactly.
so before we get to John, because I know we talked about John a little bit, and I definitely want to talk a little bit more about John, I want to talk about why inking, especially because everybody talks about inking in a certain way. Only true artists and creators understand, mostly understand why the inking job is so important, especially in the world of comics.
Right. Well, okay. So inking was you basically I saw you've got Keith Williams coming on later this week and stuff, but Keith and I have discussed that you don't usually choose to be an inker if you've got a humongous ego. Because it's like if you're in a rock band, you really need the drummer, but he's behind the kit. He's not center stage with all the spotlights right on him, except for when he gets his drum solo. And inking is kind of like that. It's a really important part of the process, but it's not generally considered the star part. It's not we're always the third name down on the list. The writer comes first, the penciler comes second, and then that inker guy who nobody understands.
And unfortunately, I'm sorry, and unfortunately, sometimes it's not even the inker's not even recognized, right?
Yeah. Well,
So
even one of my choice, and this again kind of goes to the ego thing, is that I actually decided when I decided to become an inker, because I started out as a painter. You can see the Joker painting behind me. I've got a Carnage painting behind me. So I actually started out as a painter, and when I started in comics, I was penciling and inking my own stuff. But I've always, ever since I was a kid, I actually loved line work. I love pen and ink. I love the gradations of value and the textures and stuff that you can do in line. And comics is one of the few places where that still exists. Not too many places you can get work just doing inking, right? Or even black and white printed work isn't that viable as a career. But in comics, it was. So when I made the decision to be an inker, it was for a variety of reasons. The first reason was I found out that penciling and inking a book a month is really hard. And I was doing that. I started out penciling and inking a book a month. And I realized that even though I do like storytelling, it takes a long time. And I found out pretty quickly that I'm actually not only good at inking because I know how to pencil and I know how to color. That middle guy, it's helpful to understand the other parts on both sides. So I kind of help the penciler. I know anatomy really well, so I can fix things. And I also think in terms of where the colorist is going after me. So I give the colorist as many cues to lighting and values and things like that, which not every inker understands that. But anyway, so finding that middle path was because I found out it was really tough to pencil and ink a monthly book, which when I started, you didn't do comics unless you could do monthly.
Yeah.
And I found out by just doing the math, it was kind of simple that I said, well, if you just pencil, you get A amount. And if you just do inking, you get B amount, which is always less than A amount. But if you can ink 2 books a month, B plus B equals more than A. Okay. So I found out that I was actually faster at inking because I used all my drawing skills, helped me be quicker at it. And I was very confident with brushes and quill pens and the materials because I've been practicing it since I was in high school. So I found out I was relatively fast at inking. And also in comics, inking is a very steady job. You know, if you're good at it, if you're one of the top inkers, you're pretty much always working. That's why I've been so productive in my career, because they're like, oh, we need a project, Scott can do it, and call up Scott. So for a lot of my career, I was doing 3 or 4 books a month. Literally for decades, I was doing that quantity of work. And very few artists in illustration ever can say, oh yeah, I'm working every day of every week of every month of every year and without a stop. And, you know, so that's the good fortune of being a lot of a good colorist can have the same kind of thing that, you know, good colorists are always on call. They're always getting projects and there's almost never downtime for the top colors. But anyway, so I like the reliability of it. I love the fact that the black and white stuff was what gets printed, whereas the pencils get erased. And the income was actually higher than if I was just a penciler.
Interesting. Yeah, because again, you know, you mentioned the great artists, right? So I think of Terry Austin. I think of why am I blowing blank now? I think of Scott Williams. Apparently another Scott, right? Scott Williams.
Klaus
I think
Janson.
yes, that was the name. Klaus Janson. That was what I was thinking.
Actually, you can just look at like all the inkers who have inked over John Romita Jr. and you get like the A list of inkers, basically.
Exactly.
You know?
And then all the inkers that inked over Jim Lee, and you get Scott Williams.
Right.
So and then we got the middle ground with Keith Williams. So I don't know what's going on between the three of you. But Klaus is just there, right? A great guy. I got the chance to talk to him years ago, and he was such a important part of my understanding to the inking process, especially when he was inking a lot of Frank Miller's work,
right? Yeah.
Which was to you know, a lot of people talk about Frank's art style being very unique and very different, right? But a lot of it's a lot of Klaus involved into it. Yeah. Where you look at Dark Knight, I think Dark Knight is a great piece of art and literature because of the 3 people involved, right? This is where you have Frank, you have Klaus, and then you have Lynn as well. Because that was one of those rare times at that era where a colorist was being recognized. You know what I mean? Because colorists didn't really get recognized in those days like they do today. One of the things that I wanted to ask you a little bit about is when you receive a page from someone, all right, what is your process of what you want to do with it? Obviously, when you have someone like John Romita that you're used to working with, that's one thing. But when you get some work from someone that you probably haven't worked with that often, or you never worked with, what is the process before you sit down and actually get that pen or that quill and start doing the process?
Well, in my early days in the industry, we had very different setups. Like normally I was on a monthly project, and a lot of times I would be on a book for a minimum of a year. Sometimes, like on Detective Comics, I had a 5-year run. On Spider-Man, I was on the book for like 15 years without a break, or on the character at least. But when I was starting out, it would usually take me almost half an issue to get really used to a new artist's style. Because when I chose to become an inker, actually one of the other reasons why I became an inker was because I had somebody else ink my pencils, and I hated the result.
I know that feeling.
They ruined. I was like, I'm going to make this inker proof. I'm going to make these pencils really tight and super clean, and there's no way they can screw it up. And they screwed up everything. Okay. Sorry to the guy who worked on me, but I was not happy with the end result. And so that was also a key thing that I said, okay, I want control of what gets printed, right? I wanted control of the printing stage, not that beginning stage, and hope it gets good at the rest of it. But so I also decided that I wanted to respect my penciler's work. I didn't like I love Klaus Janson as a guy and as an artist, but he's a very heavy-handed inker, so that you always know it's Klaus inking a project, right? And you never mix it up with anybody else. It's okay. Klaus is doing it. It's going to look like Klaus. Whether he works with John Romita Jr. or Frank Miller or somebody else, it's always going to look like Klaus. And I actually went from a different perspective because I wanted to respect the penciler's work like I thought I had not been respected when I was inked over. I said, I'm going to turn more into a chameleon, that I want to showcase their skill set and their style. And it's still me. I'm still part of it, but I'm doing it in a way that fits the style of the pencil artist. And that's why I've been told many times over the past 30 years that it's like, wait, you worked on that too? You worked on that? Yeah, because they see my name, but they can't see my style necessarily. Now, I can see my style, but a lot of non-artists, they see the penciler more than me, which is the way I designed it that way. I prefer it that way. But there are certain artists I work with, like John Romita Jr., he actually wants me to be a little bit more me, but even so, I still try to ink him to showcase his pencil style, which is different than anybody else's. But anyway, so when I work with a new artist, the first thing I try to do is get into their head and say, okay, what style are they using? Are they being more cartoony? Are they slicker? Are they angular? Are they sharp and hard edged? So that all those things actually determine what tools I use. So some artists I'm mostly a pen inker on. Some artists I'm mostly a brush inker on. Some I'm 50-50. And I determine what tools I'm using depending on what the style of the pencil artist is. Like somebody like Alan Davis, very fluid penciler. When I worked with Tom Rainey, very fluid penciler. But when I worked with, I'm trying to think of somebody right off the bat. But actually, the artist I'm working with right now on Batman is much more angular. So I'm using a lot more pen work, a lot more sharp, hard edges. So I really try to fit it to the artist I'm working with. And that's the very first determination. And now I've been doing it so long, I can literally switch styles at a moment's notice. So you give me like, a page of somebody new that's due tomorrow, and I'll just analyze it immediately, figure it out, do it, and it's done in their style. So I'm kind of like a professional forger, that I can forge almost any style out there. And that the only time I actually have gotten into trouble, at least from my point of view, is sometimes I have pencilers who ask for a style that I don't see in the pencils. So somebody is like saying, oh, I want this to be inked like a Scott Williams image book, but I don't see that style in the pencils. It's really hard for me to make that jump. Now, if I actually get Jim Lee pencils, I can ink it like Scott Williams, no problem, because it looks like Jim Lee, right?
Yeah.
But if the pencils don't look that way, it's hard for me to make that an artificial adjustment. And it's only happened a couple of times, but usually it's pretty easy.
Yeah, because when you see something like a Scott Williams piece, it's easily noticeable. I notice it a lot because of a lot of the cross hatching that comes along with it, and it's very scratchy in its style, where you just like you could tell that it was just very quickly done rather than meticulously just do like those simple lines. When you need the lines, the time for it, then it's there. But when you see work like that, and it's true what you said, it's hard to see a Scott Hanna's book and say, oh, that's Scott. But at the same time, there are times like when you see a John Romita that I say, okay, I know that was Scott's work that made pop out. Or when I see a Bagley, I know that was Scott that did that.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's just certain things
and actually the part of the reason for that is you just named two of the pencilers I love to work with. Actually, the Carnage behind me on this side is over Bagley. I'm currently working with John Romita on Spider-Man, obviously, but both of those artists are kind of what I call old school pencilers, in that they don't pencil super. They're both detailed. All the information is there. They're both phenomenal artists, but they understand it's a partnership, and they understand that the inker is going to kind of take it and run with it a little bit. And they don't say, oh, don't change anything or don't add anything. They don't do that. They say, hey, if you want to add stuff, go for it. If you want to adapt things, go for it. They kind of trust the partner. And that's why I like working with them. And that's why when I work with Mark or John, you can more tell it's me, because you can say, oh, Scott Hanna inks that guy different than everybody else inks that guy. And actually, like, one of the really, what I consider a really phenomenal compliment I got from David Finch. Now, David Finch is another one of the.
I was going to mention him.
he's worked with all of the top inkers in the industry. I mean, you name the inker, he's pretty much worked with them, and he's had some stellar partners and stuff. But I was working with him on Wonder Woman, and at first he was a little bit wary of working with me because he didn't know my style. He was like, I haven't seen a David Finch style. It's like, of course not, because I haven't worked with David Finch yet, So I'm only going to do a David Finch style when I get David Finch pencils. So anyway, I started working with David, and he very quickly started realizing that we were actually a very good match, and I understood his thinking really quickly, because we both, we think the same way in a lot of respects. But the best compliment he gave me was that there's one double page spread of Wonder Woman fighting a villainess, and there were all these buildings with all these bricks in the background. And I was like, oh, cool. I love doing texture, right? I love doing bricks. So I'm like, all these bricks I get to ink. And so I went to town on them. And after he saw the page, he's like, Scott, I've never seen anybody ink bricks the way you did. I'm like, yep, nailed it. That's the way. Because I wasn't trying to be somebody else. I was trying to be me and David, and that combination was unique, and it stood out from all the other inkers that have worked with them. So when you work with certain pencilers like that, they encourage you to be yourself and add to the process, and that my dream anytime I work with a team is that every part of the team is trying to improve the process. So you start off with a great writer, you get a great penciler, you get a great inker, you get a great colorist, you even get a great letterer, a great editor. If all those people are doing their part, where everyone is lifting up the next one, or is lifting it up a little bit, and then the next one's lifting up a little bit, and unfortunately, any one of those as a weak link can also drag something down. But if you've got them all working together, the culmination is greater than any one of us could do by ourselves. And to me, that's why I love the collaborative nature of comics and working as a team because of that, because we all make each other better.
Yeah, and I was going to mention David Finch. He was a name that was popping in my head as a penciler that really is, best way I could describe it is like an inking penciler, right? Where
I've told him this. He absolutely thinks like an inker. Like he really understands shadows and texture, and so everything I need is there. And David was also one of those that said, "Okay, look, I love texture, and I'm going to put in a lot of detail, but I want you to add more." And I'm like, cool, that's what I'm here for, So as soon as an artist tells me to add more to it, I'm like, fantastic. That makes it a joy,
Yeah. So you mentioned a lot of pencilers that you loved working with. I'm not saying that to name names, but has there been moments where you just didn't work well with a certain person's pencils? Nothing against the person's artwork, and it was great, but the pencils didn't work with your inks. One
of the cases, I actually won't mention the name, but was the exact situation I mentioned before, where he had what I thought was a very kind of rounded, almost cartoony aspect to his artwork, and he wanted to be inked like an image artist. And I'm like, I literally couldn't make that leap to go from what I saw as his style and what he saw as his style, because I couldn't see it in the pencils. And there was another art. I worked with a really phenomenal artist who had mostly been inking himself, and the editors literally said, "Scott, we don't want you even talking to this guy. We want you to do your thing over him," right? And because they weren't wanting the direction he had been going in, they wanted my direction, and so they said, and I like to work with my team. I don't necessarily have to talk to them all the time, but I like to make them happy. And this time they're like, don't even try to make him happy. Just, we want you to make it look like a Marvel book, right? So the editors were very happy with me, but the penciler was not happy at all. And that only lasted, I think we worked together for like a year. And after that, it was too frustrating for both of us because we wanted to communicate, and that's not what the editors wanted. That's not what the bosses wanted. And there have been a couple other times where sometimes just the penciler and I have different points of view. You can have two very talented people, but it doesn't mean they actually click, But very fortunately for I would say the vast majority of my work, I'd say easily like 95%, I've never had any difficulties with any of the artists I've worked with.
Yeah. Now, talking about artists that you haven't worked with, are there any artists that you have worked for whatever reason being, obviously they may not be with us anymore and like that you would have loved to have worked with, or if possible to work with?
Well, one of my greatest regrets is that I started my career mostly at DC. I worked exclusively for DC for several years before I made the jump over to Marvel, and then for a long time I was working for both companies. But by the time I got to Marvel, several of my heroes were gone. Okay. So I really wish I had had the opportunity to work with John Buscema. Never got a chance to work with him. He was out of the field by the time I was there. I never got a chance to work with, I'm going to blank. I hate when this happens. I got a picture in my brain. I'm just literally going to blank on his name. Anyway, there are a couple other artists like that I wish I had been able to work with, but it never happened. But then at the same time, a lot of my heroes that I grew up with, I did get to work with. Like I got to work with Kurt Swan very briefly. I got to work with Jim Aparo. I got to work with Walter Simonson. I mean, I grew up loving Mike Grell's stuff. So all these artists that actually had, even guys like Grell and Simonson had mostly been inking their own stuff for years. I'm like, okay, there's no way I'm going to get to work with these guys. But an opening came up and they called me. I'm like, yay, I get to work with my childhood heroes kind of thing. I got to work with John Byrne, guys like that I never thought I'd get a chance to work with, and I did. But there's some modern artists I haven't really worked with because most of my career has been spent at Marvel and DC. Like I haven't worked with hardly any of the Image guys, right? I worked a tiny bit with Silvestri and Larson, but I've never worked with McFarlane, for instance. I'd love to do something with him at some point. I really haven't done anything with Jim Lee. I know he's got a very super competent partner in Scott Williams, but I would love to get my hands on his work for just a little bit. I did get to work with people like Neil Adams, another guy I grew up loving his stuff. I've been able to work with him professionally. So the vast majority of guys I wanted to work with, I have, but there's still, some holdouts that I haven't really done yet.
Yeah, you mentioned a few names like Mike Grangle and Walter Simonson, who are two completely different styles, right?
Oh yeah.
And then you mentioned Eric Larson, and when you look at Eric Larson, obviously you can see the Walter Simonson love all over the place. And I love Eric Larson's. His work is so great. And there's times I look at it and Eric Larson to me is one of those artists that even in his worst work, his worst stuff, because it's like I just sketched that quickly, and it, but it's like, damn, it still looks good. You know what I mean?
Well, and he's another guy like me. He's a total workaholic. That he's, I think Savage Dragon is the longest continually published book like ever or something.
Yeah, I think he's fighting with McFarlane on that one. But
right, but he's been writing and drawing every single issue. He's not just like. Todd was inking a lot of the issues and stuff or writing, but Eric does it all, and it's like it's insane. So, but that's why I get along with him well, because we're both like, we're kind of the old-fashioned true pros, so that we do the work, to the best of our ability, obviously.
All right, so let's go over some of these books that I grabbed, and some of them you actually even mentioned. So let's go into this.
Okay.
And we'll start with one of the books that I saw your name in this list, and it's The War of Gods. And the reason why I picked this one out was really because of Perez.
Yes.
So you got the chance to work with Perez?
Well, yeah, this was actually the very first time I ever got to work with George. It was only a brief bit. I think he was doing thumbnail or layouts or breakdowns, we call it. So it required finishes over his work. But I really enjoyed it. This was literally the first time I got to work with George. And then later on, when he started working on the Avengers again, he was actually looking for inkers. And he and I actually share the same art dealer. So the Artist Choice represents a ton of different artists. But my art dealer kept saying to George, like, you want to work with Scott Hanna. You really want to work with Scott Hanna. And at that time, this was still years ago, we didn't have blue lines. You either worked on the real pencils or you light box something. And George actually, because he wasn't really familiar enough with my work, because I'd only done a little bit on War of the Gods, he said, oh, I want Scott to do some samples. And every time I ever tried doing light box samples, it always turned out like garbage. I like to read the real pencils. I like to see the sensitivity of the line and all the slight touches. And that doesn't ever work when you're light boxing something. Nowadays, blue line captures more of it, but still not as good as the original pencils. But anyway, so I tried doing samples. George didn't like it, didn't pick me. And then near the end of his run, the regular inker, I think it was Alve or something, wasn't able to do an issue. So they called me in to do finishes over George. And I was like, cool, I get to work with George again. So I did it. George loved it. I loved working with George. And that was right before George went to DC. And I was like, oh, man. So he's like, wow, I'd love to work with you again. But at that time, I think I had an exclusive at Marvel. He had an exclusive at DC. So we never ended up and we've worked together like at conventions, and we know each other, and we really respect each other. But I never got to have my like 5-year run over George Perez, which I would have loved, but it just never happened,
It's one of those situations like that's a challenge working with someone like George Perez with this ultra detailed work.
Right. But I love a challenge. I always like to be pushed. So if you throw something that's hard at me, I embrace it. I'm like, cool, I get a new challenge here.
Yeah. That would have been great to see a lot of work. I love George's work. He's not my favorite. He's definitely in my top 5. My favorite will always be Art Adams. I love
Art's amazing. He's another guy. I wish I had the chance to work with him.
Yeah.
Pretty much now he always inks his own work, and he does a spectacular job. But he's another one, insanely detailed, but I love his work, his skill set. And I would love to, I've done some like commissions over his stuff, which I really, really enjoyed, but I never got to work with him on a published piece.
Yeah. All right. Another one that you mentioned earlier, which we'll talk about, was Spider-Man Batman. So how did this project come about?
Okay.
Yeah, talk to me.
All right, so this was a really cool project because when this came about, when Marvel and DC were in their friendly period and starting to do all these crossovers, they decided they were going to do a first ever crossover between Spider-Man and Batman. And at the time, I happened to be working on Detective Comics starring Batman for DC at the same time as I was doing Spider-Man for Marvel. So I was very familiar with both characters, and I was literally working on them simultaneously for both companies, because at that point I did not have an exclusive. And so now I had never worked with Mark Bagley before. So originally, I think Mark Farmer was supposed to be working over Mark on this. And so actually the cover is inked by Mark Farmer, not by me. I did 90% of the interiors. But Mark actually didn't really click that well. So I was essentially second choice because I'd never worked with Mark Bagley. Mark wasn't sure what I was going to be like or anything, but my Marvel editors and my DC editors were like, no, we want Scott Hanna on this. And especially because the Mark Bagley was not familiar with doing Batman. So they said, Scott, we need you to make it look like Batman, not like Spider-Man in a bat suit, right? So no offense, Mark is one of the top artists I've ever worked with. I always love working with him, and he's one of those guys that continually keeps getting better. Like the older it gets, he keeps getting better and better and better. But at this time, he was still so used to doing like this big-headed Spidey and very slender characters that he tended to do Batman with too big of a head and too narrow of a waist. And so my Batman editors were like, Scott, you got to fix his Batman. So I would make these subtle adjustments. Usually it was all about like making the head smaller and widening the waist a little bit on Batman. Pretty much everything else kept the same. But anyway, I loved working with Mark. He liked me working with me, and that started a really long relationship. That this was the very beginning of my working with Bagley. Then we went on to do Thunderbolts together, Ultimate Spider-Man. I've done, tons of Spider-Man stuff with him. I've done Deadpool. I've done all kinds of things with him. But he's a phenomenal artist, really just another solid pro, always meets his deadlines, always is usually ahead of schedule. And I just really understood him, and I was really always happy whenever I got a chance to work with him.
Yeah, and Mark Bagley is one of those guys that really understands how to make a character look different sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
His Spider-Man is like the most agile Spider-Man. I mean, lots of people do a good Spider-Man, but Mark manages to twist it and turn it. It's not just the knowledge of anatomy, it's how to move that anatomy,
Mm-hmm.
And doing stuff like that. Characters like Spider-Man are not as easy as you think they are. You think, oh, everybody knows Spider-Man, everybody can draw him because he's just eyes in a web mask. But there's a lot going on with Spider-Man, with the architecture, with the body movement, with all the characters he fights against and stuff. It's really, really tough to do that character well. And Mark obviously can.
And it must have been tough for him, I'm sure, because he was coming off of he was the guy that followed the footsteps of McFarlane, then Larson,
right.
then became that. And so it's like you went from McFarlane, which again, his Spider-Man is one of the best Spider-Mans you've ever seen, because it's so different, right?
Yeah, it was so unique.
It was so unique. It was so different, but it was so Spider-Man too, right? It was like it was so different from everything that happened before it. And then Larson came in and kind of brought back a little bit of that older version of Spider-Man, but it was like the marriage of Ditko and Remedios. That's how I refer to Eric Larson's version of Spider-Man. It's like it's Ditko because you see the Ditko influence there, but you got the Remedios influence there as well, which made it like amazing to see. And then you got Bagley that came afterwards, and when he first came into the book, it was like, oh, he's just another artist. That's how it came across.
That's actually how it started. But that's why I said he's one of those. You can actually see the evolution of his work over the years, that he literally kept getting better and better and better. And it's amazing.
Yeah. And like you said, it evolved in time to the point that he was just so used to drawing Spider-Man. But then what made it great is that he also knew when it was time to change it up. Yeah. So that's where So his version of Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, is completely different than Ultimate version, but it's coming from the same guy.
Exactly.
Right? So it could have, they picked the right guy for Ultimate. I'll give it that much. But what was great about it was that he knew that obviously the Spider-Man that we're looking at right now, that's not Ultimate Spider-Man. Even though the eyes are the same size, he's a little bulkier. He looks a little older and bigger.
Yeah.
Where obviously Ultimate was an actual kid Spider. So that's what made him. And then his Spider-Man became the Spider-Man that a lot of this generation knows, right?
Oh, yeah.
So if anything, he's the Tom Holland version of Spider-Man.
One of my look back regret type of things is that when Mark was first offered Ultimate Spider-Man, we had been working together, and he asked me to work with him. And he said, I'm only going to be on the book for about 6 months because it's this, another origin story thing, and I don't know who this Brian Michael Bendis guy is. He literally, Bendis was like a newcomer kind of. And Mark really didn't sound very thrilled about it. So I'm like, Mark, I don't want to just work with you. I'd rather be with you on something that, you know, goes for a couple of years. I don't want to just be on 6 months or something. And so he asked me once, I turned him down. He ended up asking me 5 times, and I turned him down 5 different times. And now I'm like, man, if I had said yes, I would have been able to do literally every single issue that he did.
Wow.
Because I'm fast enough to keep up with him. But because I said no, and it's funny because I said no because I was working with Andy Kubert on Thor, and the Thor project ended up being 6 issues, and Ultimate Spider-Man ended up being what, like 150 issues or something.
Yeah,
you know?
his original run. Yeah,
Right. So I did get to work on it for a couple of years with Mark, but I didn't get to do the whole run like I might have been.
Yeah, I know when I was collecting books a lot. Now I still collect books, but not at the same rate as I used to because they're expensive, unfortunately. But for some reason, I have a very large catalog of Ultimate Spider-Man, a very large one. You know, from issue 1 on. If for some reason I might have all 100 issues of the first run, and it kind of died out.
Yeah.
I don't have that with most of the books. You know, X-Men, of course, but that's everybody. Right? She-Hulk says it best, right? Yeah, I'll rip up your X-Men books if you don't buy my book. All right. Let's talk more about Spider-Man. Oops, I skipped it.
That's not Spider-Man.
That's not the one I wanted to talk. You know what it is? I have the PowerPoint in this side. I have 2 screens.
Okay.
And this is not the PowerPoint that I'm doing it. So I have to go to the page that it's supposed to be, and that's this one.
Ah, okay, yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about this run with John Romita Jr. because again, this is an amazing run, and I want to definitely talk about 36 because there's a lot of meaning behind 36.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's first talk about the run with John Romita Jr. when you guys started taking this arc of Spider-Man.
Okay, so John and I had actually been working on Spider-Man books for a long time before we finally got onto Amazing. So we had been, I think I started working with him on Adjectiveless Spider-Man. Then we went to Peter Parker Spider-Man. Then we actually did go to Amazing Spider-Man. But it really wasn't until J. Michael Straczynski came on as the writer that kind of everything changed. You know, we started getting these different kind of stories. It was no longer the villain of the month type of situation that the Spider-Man books had been for a long time. Still really fun because I love the Spider-Man villains. You know, I've gotten to do all the classic bad guys and stuff. But when Straczynski came in, he was this like Hollywood writer who really wasn't that familiar with comic books. And so they teamed him up with one of the best storytellers in comic books, which is John Romita Jr. And the two of them together just created this magic. And this was one of those situations, too, where literally the entire team was just perfect. Like, I love the colorist we had on this book. I love the penciler. I love the writer. I love the editorial. All of us were just on, you know, doing our best work, you know, and it was all clicking and just like magic. So it's so nice to know that, you know, the colorist is going to come after you and do a phenomenal job and make your stuff look even better. It's nice to know that the penciler is going to give you great storytelling every single page. You know, when you know that's coming in, it's just such a joyful experience. Like, you want to get working on it, you know, every single page. And so, yeah, so we got to, you know, invent some new characters. So we invented Moreland. We actually have the whole, you know, kind of the totem spider powers mixing in with the Ezekiel with the almost supernatural spider powers mixed in with the scientific side. So there was some really cool stuff going on in that run, which I really, really, really enjoyed. It was just, you know, one of those perfect setups. You know, our run on this book with this team was really some of the highlights of my entire professional career. But then one of the biggest, actually the biggest thing was also, unfortunately, one of the saddest things, which was Amazing Spider-Man 36, which we commonly call the Black Issue. So before we ever had any like cool blank sketch covers or black sketch covers, they literally decided, because this issue dealt with 9/11 and the fall of the World Trade Center, they were really agonizing, kind of, what should we do for the cover, and we don't want to be just taking advantage of this situation. And all of us, like Straczynski, John, Romita, and I, had all lived in New York City or in the tri-state area, so we were very familiar with the city. Once you're a New Yorker, you're kind of always a New Yorker. And so all of us, when the event happened, we were going through this thing of like, first, is it real? You know, like you watching on TV thinking this is a special effect, this is fake. But then when you're realizing what's really happening, one of the very first thoughts that everybody I knew had was like, how can I help? What can I do? And everybody felt so helpless because it had already happened. And like, what can you do at that point? And I was thinking, I'm just a comic book artist. Like, what can I do to actually help in this situation? And Romita was thinking that, you know, all of Marvel was thinking that, because they've always been based in New York City, and our characters live in New York City. It's not a fictional Gotham City or Metropolis. It's actually New York. And that was one of the special things about Marvel. So Marvel decided they really, really wanted to do something about the event. And so they actually did several different things. They did a book called A Moment of Silence, which I got to work on with one of my steady partners at the time, Tom Rainey. I also did a story in A Moment of Silence where we actually had several stories that were all with no dialogue. It was just visuals. I did that with Mark Bagley. And then we did the full issue of Amazing Spider-Man. They decided they wanted to do one issue dealing with 9/11. And Straczynski at the time was like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to, I don't want to be taking advantage of this. Romita was like, I don't want people to think that we're like, literally taking advantage of the situation. We wanted it to be meaningful. We wanted it to be special because of what we felt about it. So when we ended up working on it, and first of all, Straczynski came up with a really good take on the story. And I think he wrote the whole thing in like a weekend, because once he got the hook for it, the beginning of it, it kind of just, he knew exactly what he wanted to write. Then John and I spent, a typical full month on it, but we were both surrounded by, we were looking at reference of all the World Trade Center, of the actual firefighters, the police officers. So we were putting like the correct like engine number on the firefighters and things like that. So it was really, really special to us that we really poured our hearts and souls into this story, right? And I to this day, and I don't think it'll probably ever change, I think this is the most important thing I've ever done in my career. And John said the same thing. One time I was doing a panel with Straczynski, and somebody said, what's the most important Spider-Man story? And I said, this issue, Amazing 36, is in my, and I grew up with Spider-Man. I've worked on Spider-Man for most of the past 25 years. So I've probably done, actually, the only guys who have probably done more Spider than me are Bagley and Romita. But I've done a ton of Spider-Man, and I think this is the most important Spider-Man story I've ever done or I've ever read. And all of us who worked on it thought that way. And so so now I frequently get asked to do commission artwork on the blank cover. And John Romita Jr. and I actually had this kind of deal that when the book first came out, as artists, we hate seeing blankness, right? So John and I basically said, anytime somebody came up to us to autograph the book, we always had to do some kind of like little head sketch or eyes of Spider-Man or something on the cover besides just our name. And if I did it first, I would always draw something. If he did it first, he would always draw something. So we had this deal going on that we always had to sketch on this cover, whether we got paid for it or not. We always did something on this cover, and that started evolving. That after a while, people started wanting to get more elaborate drawings, and now this cover is really, really hard to draw because it's not. It wasn't designed to be drawn.
It wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't designed for it.
It's glossy. It doesn't take pencil at all, so you can't sketch on it. Even colored markers usually smear super easy. So people were asking me to sketch on this, and like it's really hard to sketch on. But I finally found this silver marker that could get a nice clean line. And somebody asked me to do the World Trade Center. So I started doing these shots of the World Trade Center on the cover. And but it takes a long time. You can't sketch on it first. You have every line is the line, and you can't even rest your hand on it, because if you rest your hand on it, it will smear.
Smudge, yeah.
So you have to do it. It's kind of like Japanese ink work, that it's all like precise lines and super careful. It takes forever to dry and stuff. But I started doing that more and more, and I still get pretty much every show I do, I get a request to do at least one or two of these covers. And it's weird because John and I are like, we've drawn on every one of these covers. Like, nope, they're still come out blanks to us, and we still get to do more. But anyway, it's because it's such a special issue. I try to give it all the respect and love I can. I've done covers with badge numbers of police or firefighters that were there or who worked in New York City at the time. I've done, the New World Trade Center, like the one you have. I've done, Spider-Man. I've done very elaborate things with that because it's such an important book and it's so special, and I want it to be special till the day I die, basically.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you did draw one of my books. I think it was you and Remedia. So
Yeah.
I do have the copy of 36, and and I want to talk a little bit more about the run in general. But since we're on the topic of 36, I remember when I picked it up, and I read it. It first of all, it's a simple read. It's not a overly complex read, right?
Right.
And it's a very heartfelt book, of course. What I loved is the emotion especially behind Spider-Man.
Yes,
right? So
absolutely.
Spider-Man, that's that one scene where Spider-Man is swinging to the building, and you could tell that he's done it. He's like, he has his hands up.
Basically, Spider-Man's supposed to be an everyman hero, and so he was embodying what all of us felt of like, man, I wasn't there to rescue people. I wish, I wasn't there, and it happened. And then how do you deal with that?
Mm-hmm.
So he was really Straczynski really strongly made Spider-Man embody the average New Yorker, or the average American at that time.
Yeah, and what I loved about it, which I'm sure you guys definitely respect it, that this was not a superhero story. This was a story to pay homage to those who fought for it,
Right.
who did their best to save as many lives as they possibly could. So the fact that the superheroes weren't the heroes in this story.
Yeah, we very much wanted the superheroes to be helping the firefighters and the police and the emergency workers and the military. So I think that the issue ends with all of those guys, the nurses, the doctor, all those people saying that they're the real heroes and the superheroes were just helping them out.
Okay? Exactly, because it could have easily have become a cash grab, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right,
we really didn't want that. We tried,
And it did become a major issue. Like you had to have this issue. It was like the next Death of Superman issue type of thing for a while. But when it did come out, it was very respectful. One of the other panels that I always thought always stood out for me was the panel of the villains, right? With the one with like Dr. Doom, Kingpin are just standing there like, we wouldn't have done this kind of, kind of thing is like. So it was a very respectful book. It was the right book to come out at the right time. I love these covers. These are just some of the ones I picked out that I saw. I was like, these are gorgeous.
Thank you.
Now we're going back to the run. One of the issues that I don't remember which number was it, but it's an issue where I think it was Morlo who was hunting Spider-Man.
Yes, Marlin. Yeah.
Yeah, Marlin. And I remember reading that, and I was as I was reading that book. That was one of the very first times in a very long time I read a comic book where I was like, "How the heck is he going to get out of this one?" Because he looked helpless in that story.
Well, so, some of my absolute favorite stories in my various runs on Spider-Man, but several I've done with John Romita Jr., is when Spider-Man fights a villain who he basically can't beat. You know, like he's fought the Hulk, and there's no way Spider-Man can beat the Hulk. You know, and Juggernaut. You know, unstoppable force. Spider-Man is only so strong. But that's when I think the character is almost at his best. So Moreland was definitely that type of character that he was just too strong. There was no way Spider-Man could actually defeat this guy, at least certainly not by himself. Luckily, he had Ezekiel to give him some guidance. But yeah, so and I actually also love it because I've been working in comics for so long, and I've worked with so many, phenomenal writers and stuff. But you get jaded to a certain point and say it's like, oh man, yeah, it's I kind of know what's going to happen next or whatever. And when I get a script from a writer and it surprises me, I'm like, this is good writing. This is
and it really was like
really
that.
well done. If I can be working on Spider-Man for 15 years and still get surprised by a new script, that means the writer's doing a really good job.
Yeah, for me, it was like consistently reading books for 10 years, 10, 15 years at that time. It was just consistent. And there's always a way out. And there's always a way out, right? It's the typical Batman 67 trope, right? Where it's like, how he's gonna get out. We'll stay tuned next batch. And it's always something really, really stupid that does it. That gets him out of the jam or something like that.
Yeah, with Superman, they used to just automatically invent a new power all of a sudden.
Yeah, exactly. And I think
now we can do this. Yeah, right.
Exactly. And part of the love with Spider-Man is the fact that he doesn't always win, right?
Exactly. Yes.
He's more of a loser than any of the other ones, to the point that I remember the trading cards of back in the day with the trading card set up, they have the win-loss record. He actually has a higher loss record than a win record, which I thought was funny when I saw it at first.
But again, that to me, that's what's special about the character is that he keeps fighting despite the odds, or he literally is frequently the underdog. I mean, I hopefully I'm not giving anything away because I think some of the images are already out. But this year they're going to have Amazing Spider-Man number 900 out, which I did one of the covers with John Romita Jr. And they've got some of the classic villains in that he's fighting in the 900th issue. And if you look back in like fighting the Sinister Six, Spidey had a tough time with each one of the Sinister Six. Then you put all six of them together. It's like, there's no way he can win, right? How can he beat these guys? There's six teamed up against one little guy, and he can't win. But that's when he kind of does his best. That's that underdog attitude of that hero makes him even more special. It's really easy for Superman to win a fight because he can do everything, but Spider-Man, he's got to work for it. He's got to really struggle.
And the same could be said about Batman. It's easy for Batman to win a fight because first of all, he has all the tech and he's one of the greatest minds out there. So let's talk a little bit about inking in particular. So I took out some of the pages here. I took two in particular that I saw that stood out for me. Now I looked at both of these pages, and what I noticed about both of them were, first of all, with the Doctor Strange piece, there's more white space. So when it comes to inking with a lot of white space, how would you take that approach and really spotting those blacks that need to be spotted?
Well, one of the things that I'm a teacher, by the way, on the side. Besides my full-time working for Marvel and DC, I also, in my free time, teach. But one of the things I always stress, and this goes back to my penciling ability and my painting ability even, is that we always look at what's called positive and negative space. And a lot of, like, if you're working on Batman, obviously you're going to have lots and lots of shadows, right? But sometimes you actually need to have open space to balance out against those shadows to make it really work. A really good example of that is somebody like Mike Mignola. does a really good balance of, you think of his stuff as always being very dark, but he has a lot of white areas that's just filled with kind of flat color, or big areas of sky or mist or whatever, and it works because he's got the balance right. The Doctor Strange page is actually my first and only time I got to work with Kevin Nolan, who's also a very, very well-known inker. But he's also a phenomenal penciler. And so again, I tried to make it look like Kevin Nolan was inking himself almost. So obviously there's some of me in there, but I was trying to do some of the, the cross-hatching, the feathering, the black and white balance, the way Kevin would do it, keep as much of that as I could in the finished artwork. And so again, it's about respecting the style of the penciler I'm working with.
Now, so when you come up with making the decision, obviously you mentioned about the quill versus the pen.
Yes.
So when you do something like a Kevin Nolan example, and I'm not sure who's the artist in that other piece.
I know who it is, but I'm going blank. My brain is
But
that was from Avengers. I hate when I do this. Phenomenal penciler. I loved his stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm going blank on his name right now. Sorry.
But again, there's a lot of more, as we talked about, the more darkness, more shadow pieces into it, especially in that second panel where you see that one character who's really made up of shadow, right?
Right.
There's
absolutely.
only like a small outline of his, of the light that's popping in.
Well, for instance, you can actually see that on the Doctor Strange page, it's mostly black and white with very little what I call gray, right? There are areas of detail in between the two, like on the middle of the castle with the vines, the roof of the castle, but most of it is kind of outlined in solid black shapes with a little bit of gray. The one on the right has much less white space, but a lot more gray. Right. So what we're doing on the right hand side is sometimes silhouetting a character to make sure you can still see all the gray. So the solid black character is acting like the solid white sometimes acts. But when there's more gray, you have to be that much more careful, make sure it's still legible, make sure it's still, easy to read and easy to color. Because I still want the colorist to understand everything I'm doing, as well as putting in all the detail.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to see it, but what I'm noticing, and I can't really point to. I don't know if you guys you can't see really the size, but with panel number 3, and it's in panel 4 as well with the girl, I see it. The best way I can describe it is very similar to Spidey sense.
Yes. Yeah.
And stuff like that. Something like that. That's hard to do sometimes, right?
Well, that goes to especially panel 3 in that the texture is sometimes instead of just doing a simple black background or white lines or whatever, we like to give it energy and drama. So that energy, that psychic energy coming out of his head is supposed to be like it's alive, like it's moving. And so we throw a lot of textural lines in there. It's not just a simple, white against. Actually, in the last panel, it is more of a simple black line with a white highlight next to it. In the third panel, it's actually got lots of gray and spatter, and it's got white texture and black texture in there to make it more dynamic. So a lot of that, again, it's based on what I'm getting from the penciler. And in this case, on the Avenger, actually, I think on both of these pieces, I was doing what's called finishes, where I got rough pencils and I added to those pencils. So it was my choice to do all the fur detail, all the detail in the hair. The penciler gave me a lot of detail in the hair, but I put even more in. So it was my job to make it look like rocks or whatever, all that stuff.
Yeah, and these are 2 great pieces.
Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about some of your upcoming projects. Let's start with one, Duo. So talk to me a little bit about Duo for DC.
Well, Duo is a very interesting project because we actually started it almost 5 years ago. It was supposed to be part of the Milestone universe at DC, and I think in the first iteration they had one kind of zombie book through Milestone, and it never really went anywhere. But when they were going to revamp the books with slightly more diverse creators, they were like, oh, let's, instead of just having all Black creators, let's have some like Asian, some more women, some, very multicultural. And so we actually kind of started with the idea that was originally this duo zombie book, but really basically started over from scratch. And they said, like, look, we got the title, or we got, and what can we do with it? And so this is, even though I've been doing comics for 30 plus years, I don't often get to create new characters. I don't get to be in at the ground floor when we're just starting something out. Normally, I'm always like in a couple, it's been running for 10 years. Now you get to work on it or something,
Mm-hmm.
But I've done it a couple of times, but this is one of the most recent times where we literally started out creating brand new characters that never existed before, doing our own take on it, creating brand new villains that had never existed before. Really cool stuff. Very cool concept. I won't give away too many secrets because the first issue isn't out yet, but it's very modern. The two main characters are both Asian, but from slightly different cultures of Asia. They have two totally different points of view. One's male, one's female. One's a little bit more aggressive. One's a little bit more logical, we would say. They're both scientists. They come up with this new technology that essentially gives them superpowers. Then they have to figure out, how does this work in the real world? How does this, how is this connecting to things, and what are the drawbacks of it? That it's not, having superpowers is, especially in the world of comics, is not always a wonderful thing. There are a lot of negatives to things.
Yeah.
So anyway, the story is great. The penciler I've been working with is phenomenal, and we're just having a lot of fun with it. But the most rewarding thing is, literally, we started the book 5 years ago. It was canceled on us. Then they restarted again, was canceled on us again when COVID hit. And now finally, after all this time, they kept the exact same creative team, and it's coming out the way we wanted it to. And it's now finally going to be out. I think the first issue is out in May.
That's the book that just didn't want to stop, right?
Yes. No, it was meant to be, and I'm so happy that it finally is going to be seen and hopefully acknowledged, because I think it's a really cool story, really great art. Again, the whole team is really solid, from writer, penciler, inker, colorist. All of us are working really well together. Each of us is like amping up the level of quality, and I'm just really happy with it, really proud of it. I'm glad it's finally getting out there.
Awesome. All right, now let's go with the main event.
These guys, yeah.
You're coming back to the
right.
to the ones that we're all excited about, right? So what was it like being told, hey, you guys want to do Spider-Man again?
Well, they're basically, ever since I was a kid, my two favorite characters are Spider-Man and Batman. So anytime I get a call to do a Spider-Man project or a Batman project, I'm like, I'm there. Okay, that it's just an automatic. I'm ready for it. But it's one thing to say, oh yeah, you're just going to do a couple issues or whatever. It's another thing when they say, hey, you're working on the main title and you're going to be the regular team on it, and you get to work with a team member that you've worked with before that you know really well, right? So so for quite a while, John Romita Jr. was exclusive to DC, and weirdly enough, even though I was working at DC, they never teamed us up together at DC. So I don't know why, but they never let me work with John at DC Comics.
Like, no, he worked with him over there.
Like, I've done Batman, I've done Superman, but no, don't work with John Romita Jr. It's like, huh? What? Sometimes I'm totally mystified with how editorial works. It's like, they should have known we worked together. They had both of us as assets never teamed us up at DC. But when John started coming back to Marvel, especially when they started negotiating with him to come back on Amazing Spider-Man, I think I was kind of the logical choice, let's put it that way, because we had that long run on all the Spider-Man, but we literally worked together on various Spider-Man books for almost 10 years without a break. Like every single month for 10 years, we were doing Spider-Man together. And we grew over that time. So we both, evolved our styles, and it really culminated working with Straczynski on our run on Amazing. And so when John came back on Amazing, he really asked for me. He said he wanted to work with me, and I absolutely wanted to work with him because I was actually very frustrated. I hadn't worked with him at DC. I'm like, oh man, I wanted to work with John, so when they called me to work with John on Amazing, I'm like, I'm there, and and both of us, because this is our core character that we're both most known for. We're like, we want to do our very best work. We want to, really kill it. This is not, oh, we're old pros. We're just being lazy and cashing in a paycheck. This is us showing we're really mature artists. We know what the heck we're doing. We're doing really solid stuff. And we're working with, weirdly enough, I was not that familiar with Zeb Wells, the writer's work, even though he had been working at Marvel at some time. Our paths really hadn't crossed. So I'm like, who's this Zeb Wells guy? And the editors who I had been working with, Nick Lowe is the main Spider-Man, he was like, we've worked with him a lot. He's a great writer. So I started getting the scripts. And one of my philosophies is I always try to read the script. So not every inker does that. A lot of inkers are like, oh, the pencils are clean enough. I know what's going on. I'm going to do it. I really like to read the script whenever possible. And so I started reading the script and like, wow, okay, this is some really cool stuff. I like all the things you were talking about, Peter being, Spider-Man being an underdog and having to deal with situations he can't really handle, sometimes losing a fight, but still making it work. All those things, that the dynamic in his personal life is different now than it had been in previous incarnations when I worked on the character. So it's still, the writing is very new to me. He's taking some characters, like one of the main characters in the first story arc, one of the main bad guys is Tombstone, which I really had not worked on Tombstone very much in my long career on Spider-Man. So I always thought of him as kind of like a B-list gangster character. Like, yeah, he shows up every now and then, he's muscle or something. But Zeb is taking this character and really fleshing him out and doing some amazing stuff with him. So to me, it's like the best Tombstone storyline I've ever read. And that's just one aspect of it. There's all this other stuff going on. So yeah, I'm really happy with it. I'm really happy to be working with John. I'm really happy working with John at literally the peak of his career. We've done great stuff together, but I think his storytelling is just so immaculate. It's so dramatic. Everything about it is it's just like going back home, like where we're meant to be, kind of thing.
Yeah, I immediately took a notice to one thing that's a little different, and that's the eyes.
Well, in some respects, John was going back a little bit more toward his father, right? Mm-hmm. He if you notice the head shape and the eyes are a little bit more like John Romita Sr. Than they were when we had our last Amazing Spider-Man run. But again, that's one of the things that we're allowed to make our own mark on the character and make it distinctively ours. It's not Mark Bagley's version of Spider-Man. It's not, Todd McFarlane's version. It's our version. We get to do it the way we want to do it to a large degree.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to Spider-Man, Spider-Man is one of those characters that I don't think there's many other characters that you think of a specific artist that's done it in a certain way. There really aren't that many. It's besides Spider-Man. I'm trying to think if Batman's that type of character or Superman's that type of character, but Superman probably is the closest thing to it, I'll say. But in Spider-Man's case, it's like, how you draw the eyes is this guy draws the eyes this way versus that way, or this. Like in this particular version of what I'm looking at is that it almost looks like his eyes on the top more look like they both look like eyebrows. in a weird
Yes,
way.
it's very heavy on the upper lid.
On the upper, where the lower part is more thinner.
Actually,
So which is a little different from the original runs that you guys had. But it's who's complaining?
this is actually
That's nice.
This is one of the unused pages from issue 1. So we
Below that,
decided
so we can see it a little better. So let me do this.
Okay. But one of the things that because John and I worked many times before, but John started doing a lot of this kind of like gray tone stuff, and I was like, John, it's a lot more work, but I love it because I get to play with the textures and the values. And I said, John, so yeah, keep doing all this like gradation work, and that lets me play more and have more fun with it. So, and then the colorist is using all that and picking up on it. And sometimes they knock it back and make it a different color than black or something. But it's the end results are really good. I'm really happy with what the book looks like.
Yeah, and it sounds like it has a very promising future.
Yeah,
based on the information you're telling us.
Well, as far as I'm aware, we're going to be on the book for some time. Okay, so we're not in just for like 3 issues and out the door again. We're actually going to be in there for a while.
That's always good to hear. I love seeing the sequential artists. This is the era of a lot of cover artists, and you don't get to know who's the sequential artist.
Well, I've talked to fans for a long time that get very frustrated that they don't have that reliability of knowing what the book looks like from month to month on the inside when you're actually reading the books. It's nice to come back to the same artists, and in the modern era of graphic novels and stuff, they so many times have, oh yeah, one artist does 3 issues, another artist does 3 issues, or maybe you'll have a long run of 6 whole issues. And I'm used to, like I said, John and I were on various Spider-Man books for 10 years without a stop. I mean, literally every month for 10 years. And the fans get comfortable with that. They like that. They know what they're getting when they're buying their books. And so I like giving that to them too.
Yeah, it's some of the things that's changed in the business, and I'm a big fan of. I like when I see the cover being, represented by the sequential artist. I understand as well why having a cover artist, because even I think in your original run with Spider-Man, you guys had J. Scott Campbell in some of your covers.
Yeah, some of the covers, but
some of the which are gorgeous, by the way.
I'm actually happy that yes, I know Amazing Spider-Man 1 has like a slew of variants. I don't even know how many, but John and I are doing the regular prime covers of every issue that we're working on. So yeah, the cover artists and the interior artists on the main book are the same, which is great. I love that,
Yeah, it's something that you get to see, and it's like it's also part of the story, right?
Yeah.
When you could take the cover and you could do a scene, within the book. Obviously it's a cover, so it's not actually a scene, but it's a different camera area. It's almost like a trailer, right? It's kind of like a trailer piece, right? Where when you have another artist does a cover, sometimes it's just a pinup.
You can actually see that this is very similar in a way to the actual cover that you showed earlier. So because they're similar swinging pose and stuff, but it fits the story obviously.
Yeah, so I can't wait. This is the book that I've been waiting for. I'm gonna be very honest. I've been waiting for this book when I heard it.
I'm really excited about it. The sad thing is that originally the book was supposed to be released this week, and it turned out that I believe that the printer actually ran out of paper because the orders were so high for the issue. The numbers were so big that they literally ran out of paper at the printers, and they had to push it back a couple of weeks. And that way also they got more late orders coming in and stuff. But I don't know the exact numbers, but apparently the sales are just through the roof.
It's going to be a big one. Yeah, it's definitely going to be a big one.
So, and John and I are actually doing, I think we're doing something like 8 shows together this year, where we'll be literally sitting next to each other, specifically because of Amazing Spider-Man coming out.
Yeah, so it's gonna be. I'll get my copy, and when I see it, I'll make sure you guys sign
Very
it
good.
for me and stuff like that. The other book that I'm excited for is the Fantastic Four run that's going to happen with the new Fantastic Four, the Adams version
Yeah.
of so that was always a fun book, and I was like, oh, they're bringing it back. And then they got what, Stegman, that's his name, Ryan Stegman,
Right,
to do it,
yeah.
which I think he's fine, but it's like, I know he's a bit of an Art Adams guy, just come on, you could have just told Art to do at least the covers for that one. But it's been great having you, Scott. So,
Yeah.
is there anything else you would like to plug before we end today's broadcast?
Well, very quickly, yeah, I am doing a whole bunch of shows this year. Actually, too many to list them all. But if you can see me or John in a show, I always do commissions and sketches and stuff. I also teach. My school is artsandfashioninstitute.com. Most of you pretty much have to live in Pennsylvania to come to my school, but I occasionally do online classes for students. If you want to contact me on Facebook, it's Scott Hanna on Facebook, or Inker Scott on #Inker Scott on Instagram.
Thank you, Scott. All right, Scott, I'm going to put you in the lobby for a few minutes, and then we'll talk while I end the broadcast.
All right.
So thank you, Scott, for joining us. Take care.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. That was great, Inker. Great conversation with Scott Hanna. I just want to throw in some last minute stuff with you guys. Again, be on the lookout for our Mocha Show videos. I did a lot of videos. They're going to be coming out throughout the duration of the week. Maybe into next week, we'll have a few. Wednesday is the CAP Wrestling Academy. It's going to be fun talking to some of those guys. Again, it's a wrestling show. I don't get to have them that often. Our second half of Inker's Week will be with Keith Williams. That's going to be on Thursday. We'll talk a little bit about his work as well and the differences of what he does as opposed to what Scott Hanna does. And talking about Free Comic Book Day, Spider-Man will be one of those books. So one of the books will be Scott Hanna's Spider-Man. So be on the lookout for that one. And of course, you can always go to Squiggy's Dugout to get your comic books, guys. With that said, I'm going to see you guys next time on the IzzyVerse. So take care. Bye.